Hello, A&P Lab students. Let me introduce myself. I am Professor Samuel Skeleton. Your normal instructor, Professor Allner, felt that I might have a, shall we say, unique insight into the appendicular skeleton. I know Professor Allner is about somewhere, but I am not quite certain what I think of that man. He seems to find himself quite amusing, using me as a prop in last week's lab. You will see me from time to time in this particular online lab, so join us now for the study of the appendicular skeleton. Once in a while, I wonder if perhaps I'm spending a little bit too much time by myself in the A&P lab. But no, I'm really not, because you're here with me. So let's talk about lab number 4, the appendicular skeleton. As you know from our introduction, this is another purely anatomical lab. And the lab manual is laid out the same way for you in this lab, where we have the name of a bone, then indented under it whatever features you are responsible for knowing for that particular bone. Remember, we call these features bone markings. So just as we had for lab number 3, for this week's lab quiz and practical coming up before you know it, the questions I'll be asking you are: name the bone, the entire bone, and name the part or name the structure for that particular bone, plus the 6 bones you see at the bottom left of page number 2. You're responsible for knowing a right from a left when you see it. And I'll be coaching you through each one of those bones as we make our way through today's lab. Before we do that, however, I do want to give you a big piece of advice. Just like we did with the tissues, I strongly recommend that you draw these appendicular bones first. So in lab number 3, we studied the axial skeleton: the skull, the vertebrae, the ribs, and the sternum. In today's lab, it's all the other bones. What's called the pectoral girdle and the upper limb, the pelvic girdle and the lower limb. But the nice thing about these bones is that once you know, for example, the femur, you will know all femurs. And these bones, with the possible exception of the scapula, are very easy to draw, and I think you'll see what I mean in just a moment. So what I'm going to do is grab one of the bones and show you, and then I will draw it for you. Look at the bone up at the top of page 1 on the right-hand side, the ulna. So here in my hand is a perfectly good ulna. Now I choose this bone as my example, not just because it sounds like my last name, not spelled the same and a little different pronunciation, so don't start calling me Professor Ulna, but I can draw this one and it doesn't have that many parts on it. I want you to notice that this particular bone, I'll bring it a little closer, looks a lot like a wrench or an ice cream scoop. So let me make a quick sketch of this bone right here on the whiteboard for you. And again, I can draw this, and if I can draw it, I think any of you can draw it as well. there's a perfectly reasonable ulna. I will do some videography and zoom in on it. So consulting your lab manual reveals to me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 specific parts of this bone, the ulna, that you must know. Now I'd like you to watch what I'm going to do. So notice what I've done with my ulna. I have drawn it, and using my textbook, I have pointed at the 5 features you're responsible for knowing. A, B, C, D, and E, like that. Each one of these bone markings has a specific name. So start up at the top with me for this list of parts. The first one that I have labeled as a D is the coronoid process. I'm going to make myself a key for this particular diagram. And since I like using different colors, I think I will. D, and I want to have a good pen, D is the coronoid process. What's next? The olecranon process. That's what I have labeled as A. The olecranon process, sometimes just called the olecranon. Then we have the radial notch, right here, C. Next up in my list is the styloid process. That's what I have labeled as E. And the only one remaining, B, this big trough right here in the bone, is the trochlear notch. Now let me ask you a couple questions, and I want you to be brutally honest with me via the internet. Is this stylistically, aesthetically, a beautiful picture of the bone? No, not even remotely. I'm not that skilled an artist. But what I have done, imagine that I make this diagram on a piece of scratch paper. Then on the other side, or in a corner, or in the margin, I produce a key for my picture, only listing those 5 bone parts that are fair game for your lab quiz. Because once you know one ulna, you're going to know any ulna that I show you. You'll see that as I take you through these various bones. So what I'm trying to demonstrate for you here is a method that you might use for studying. I will, of course, have a practice section that goes with this lab as well, but draw the bone. Label only the parts that are in your lab manual, no more. Because it is so easy to get confused when you see a picture of an ulna, a diagram, an anatomical artist's drawing, where they label every part of the bone. You don't have to know every part of the bone. You just have to know these 5. So to be very clear with you, very straightforward, I can show you one of these and say, name the bone. Ulna. Then I could show you any one of these parts and say, name this part, styloid process. Name this part, radial notch. Name this part, coronoid process, olecranon process, trochlear notch, like that. Drill and practice is what helps you. So I strongly recommend draw the bone first, and your picture has to look at least as good as this one. Then study it, go through the practice section in this online lab. So hopefully this is a method that might work for you. So let's begin with the first couple of bones on our list, bones of the pectoral girdle, which are the scapula and the clavicle. The scapula, of course, being the most challenging of these two bones. So we will consult with Sam for the actual anatomical position of these bones, where you find them, and then use an isolated bone to go over all of the parts. But some parts can best be seen right here on an articulated or put together skeleton. For example, the three borders of this bone. So follow along, be on page 1, looking under the scapula. So the name of this bone is the scapula, and you can see that it's roughly triangular in shape. Allow me to zoom in a little bit on Sam's shoulder. The three borders of the bone are the axillary armpit border, the medial, sometimes called vertebral border, closest to the spinal column, and the superior border, the one that's on the top. So on this particular bone, I can see the axillary border right here, the medial border right here, and the superior border right here under my finger. The three sides of this triangle: axillary border, medial border, and superior border. Notice, before we leave Sam for a moment, that this bone forms a joint with your upper arm bone, the humerus, and the clavicle right here, creating this joint we call the shoulder. So this first bone for us, the scapula. So here I have two perfectly good scapulas that you can see, one plastic and one real. This is a real scapula from a real person. But what I want to show you is that once you know the scapula, scapulas all look like scapulas. This is one nice thing about the skeleton. So here is a scapula from one side. This one happens to be a right scapula. And here is its mirror image, the scapula from the other side, a left scapula. I will show you how to tell a right from a left, but first you must know the parts of a bone before I can explain to you how to tell a right from a left. So let's just randomly pick this scapula right here and work our way through the parts. Now, we just saw the medial border, the axillary border, and the superior border. But this goofy piece of bone has a bunch of other things jutting off of it, doesn't it? These structures, these features, these markings that jut off the surface of a bone, often called a process, like we saw in lab number 3, but sometimes different names for specific parts of a bone. So let's begin at the top with the acromion process. And I said begin at the top for a reason. This structure right here, between my finger and my thumb, this is the acromion process. As this bone sits in a person's shoulder, the acromion, ACR, is one of the highest parts of this bone, the acromion process. If you allow me to attempt a little videography, so as the bone sits like this in a person's shoulder, notice how high this feature is compared to the others. I always picture, some person, a high dive artist, sort of diving off of this thing because it's the highest part of the bone, the acromion process. Think of the condition acrophobia, fear of high places, fear of heights, the acromion. The first part of the scapula, the acromion process. Now notice this is fairly big, fairly substantial looking on an artificial and on a real bone, even bigger on this one. Here's the acromion process right there. The other large process I see jutting off of the bone right here between my finger and thumb now, this is the coracoid process. Not coronoid like we just had on the whiteboard, coracoid process right here. So the acromion right here, the coracoid process right here. The acromion juts outward or in a lateral direction and back toward you if you're looking at somebody from the posterior side. If I turn this bone around, the coracoid process is anterior. This person is now facing us. So coracoid, smaller, acromion, bigger. Next, notice this little indentation in the bone. It's where the head of the humerus fits in a ball in socket joint like your shoulder is. This is the socket. This is called the glenoid or glenoid cavity. Sometimes you might see it referred to as the glenoid fossa. Your lab manual says glenoid cavity. You say glenoid cavity right here. This depression in the bone, see that the head of the humerus goes into. Now we have 3 fossas on this bone. What the heck is a fossa? A fossa is a depression, shallow depression in a bone. This bone has 3 of them. But I think before we learn the names of those fossas, it would probably help us to know the name of this ridge of bone right here, because these 2 fossas get their names from that ridge. This ridge of bone right here is called the spine of the scapula, or the scapular spine. Notice as I tilt the bone, it looks somewhat like a little shelf here. So the acromion process is continuous with the scapular spine. Right here, scapular spine. Once we know the spine of the bone, it makes it a little easier for us to learn these 2 fossas. Now I'm going to tilt and angle the bone in such a way, hopefully, that you can see. I'll try to get the light to catch it. There's a shallow depression right here where my finger goes, below the spine. This is called the infraspinous fossa. There's also a depression right here where my finger is, above the spine. This is called the supraspinous fossa. I'm going to say that again. the infraspinous fossa below the spine, supraspinous fossa above the spine. And if I turn the scapula over, notice this large shallow depression right here called the subscapular fossa. The subscapular fossa under the scapula. So it would be sitting like this in a person's shoulder. And to see that subscapular fossa, I'd have to rip it off and turn it upside down. Subscapular fossa, infraspinous fossa, and supraspinous fossa. Now, why do I make such a big point out of telling you the names of these three fossas? Well, there's something to be learned here at this particular moment in your A&P course. Knowing the names of these bones and their parts will help you in uncountable ways as we go through this semester and next semester and in your professional life. I kid you not. There's a muscle that lives right here in the infraspinous fossa that's called the infraspinatus. There's a muscle that lives up here in the supraspinous fossa called the supraspinatus, and one that lives here in the subscapular fossa called the subscapularis. There is also in 224 a blood vessel that's found right here called the subscapular artery that you also have to know the name of. Knowing the names of these parts will help you a lot. So this terminology is important and you have to master it. So we have the acromion process, the coracoid process, the glenoid cavity, the scapular spine, infraspinous fossa, supraspinous fossa, subscapular fossa, medial border, axillary border, superior border. Let's try it with a scapula from the other side. The mirror image. Medial border. The spine of the scapula. The acromion process. The glenoid cavity. The coracoid process, the subscapular fossa, supraspinous fossa, infraspinous fossa, medial, axillary, and superior borders of the bone. Features of the scapula. Now, how the heck do I know a right from a left scapula? Sure, they're mirror images of each other. Here's a right one, here's a left one. But how will I know when I see one? To correctly identify right from left on a bone, you need to know at least 2 sides of it. 3 sides is even better. I think most everybody can find the medial border on this bone when you see it. I think just about everybody could find the acromion process, which is at the end of the spine. And I think most everybody could probably find the glenoid cavity, right here when you see one. Knowing these features, the medial border is always medial, toward the middle of a person. The glenoid cavity is lateral. Remember, your humerus comes in here, forming your shoulder. And the acromion is up and back, or posterior. Let me say that again. The medial border is medial, duh. The glenoid cavity is lateral. And the acromion is superior and posterior. So look at this one. Is this a right or a left scapula? The first thing you do is identify the medial border. So I know this goes toward the middle of someone. Like this, or like this, if this is their spinal column. Something like that. I see the glenoid cavity, that's lateral. So I know this bone sits like so, or it sits like so, or it sits like so. I'm not really sure yet, until I see this other feature right here, the acromion. That has to go up and back. So if my patient is prone, laying face down right here on this table, this has to be up and back. So the person's head would be, say, here where my fist is. It's up and it's back. This is medial. This could not be the person's left one, because now the glenoid cavity would be where the spine is. Use your imagination to see this. This is the medial border, so it has to be in the middle of the person's body. This glenoid cavity has to be lateral on this person's body. That puts their head right here. So as they lay down facing the table, prone position, this would be a what? Right scapula. I will include some practice for these rights and lefts in the practice section of the video. Have no fear. The other bone for us in the pectoral girdle is the clavicle, also known by you perhaps as the collarbone, sitting right here. This bone forms joints with, or articulates with, the sternum on one side, remember the clavicular notch from lab 3, and the acromion of the scapula on the other side. So let me zoom in on this bone a little bit for us and ask you a couple of questions. First, using your lab manual, am I allowed to ask you right from left clavicle? This means you have to consult page 2 right now while I wait. No, this is not one of your list of 6. I cannot ask you right from left clavicle. So what can I ask you? The name of the bone, clavicle, and then those 2 features that you see listed, the sternal end of the bone and the acromial end of the bone. Now that's pretty easy to see when it's here as part of SAM in the total package. But as an isolated bone, not quite so easy unless you know what to look for. That's where I come in. Notice how the end that articulates with the sternum, and I'll rotate it a little bit here, hopefully you can see, tends to be flat vertically. That's the sternal end. The end that articulates with the acromion tends to be flat horizontally. I'll show you that a little more closely on the isolated bone. So here we have a couple loose clavicles from my clavicle box. Doesn't everybody have a clavicle box? You can see a couple plastic ones, much more durable, and a real one from an actual person. Let's look at the real clavicle first. So no other bone really has this look. Name the bone. This is a clavicle. Somewhat easy, I think. Name the bone. Then we have to look for the acromial end and the sternal end. So remember, the thing to look for on this sternal end is that this bone appears to be flat in the vertical plane. It's flat going up and down. That's the sternal end. The acromial end, it's a little more flat horizontally. So always look for this to identify which end of the bone you're looking at. For example, random clavicle right here. Where is the sternal end? Is it the end to your right or your left as you look at this video image? Hopefully you noticed it's the one over here to your right. Sternal end, acromial end. Notice the acromial end kind of wide like this and flat horizontally, not vertically. Just the other one right there, there we go. Which end is which? Sternal end, acromial end. I hope that's pretty easy for you to get. Okay, now we move away from the pectoral girdle and into the bones of the upper limb. And the first one, I think, is just incredibly funny because it's your humerus. Ba-dum-bum. I've got about 206 of those, and they don't get any better than that. So let's take a look at this humerus, what we would call the arm bone. Not forearm, but the arm, the humerus. So here you see a few humeri, humerus bones, a real one from an actual person. Notice, everyone, right here, some spongy bone. I just show you that for your lecture. There's some spongy bone surrounded by compact or dense bone. And here are a couple plastic ones. They don't have any spongy bone. But a humerus looks like a humerus, looks like a humerus. Artificial molded plastic humerus, actual humerus from a real person. So once you know a humerus, you know a humerus. Stick with me. Now let's look at a few of these parts of the humerus that you are responsible to know. Let's begin up at the top, near what's called the head of the bone. This ball that fits into the ball and socket joint of your shoulder, the socket being the glenoid cavity of the scapula. Remember that. Near the head of this bone, there are two processes that poke off the surface. There's one between my finger and thumb. There's another between my finger and thumb. I'm going to rotate the bone around. See two large lumps here with a groove between them. One under my thumb, another under my thumb. These two structures are called tubercles. Tubercles. Look for that term in your lab manual. There are actually three processes that project off the surface of a bone that start with T that you're going to see. Tubercles, trochanters, and tuberosities. The humerus has a couple of tubercles and a tuberosity on it. Now, let me show you the difference. A tubercle is a mid-sized chunk of bone projecting off the surface, and I'm sure in lecture you hear about what these are all for. Sites for muscle and ligament attachment. A tubercle is a mid-sized projection. A tuberosity, like you can see right here, my finger is on top of it right there. I'm going to angle the bone so you can see. A tuberosity is a very small bump on the surface of a bone. You can feel it easier than you can see it. Maybe you can tell there's a little lump right there at the end of my finger. Let me try to show you that same structure on this real bone. So see this small lump right there? That's a tuberosity. Hard to spot, but a tubercle is big enough that I can see it pretty easily. And trochanters, which we'll see on femur, are even larger than that. So look at the head of this bone. There's the head. And notice 1, 2 fairly easy to see projections of bone coming off the surface. Between my fingers is one of them. Now between my fingers is the other. And I want you to notice that these 2 tubercles are of different sizes. This one is larger, obviously, than that one. So looking at the names that you have on page 1, which one of these 2 do you suppose is the greater tubercle of the bone? Well, the big one, obviously. The greater tubercle is right there. The lesser tubercle is right here. Greater tubercle, lesser tubercle. And as long as we're here, why don't we look between these 2 tubercles? Do you see this groove that I'm running my finger through right here? That's the groove between the tubercles. It's called the intertubercular groove. I'm going to say it again. I'll cast a shadow in it so you can see it a little easier. The intertubercular groove. Greater tubercle, bigger one. Lesser tubercle, smaller one. Intertubercular groove runs between them. At the other end of the bone, we have a bunch of features to know the names of as well. A big dent right here. A small dent right there. 2 rolling surfaces that make up part of my elbow. And then these projections poking off either side. So let's take a look at those one at a time. First, this small dent you see right here. I'm going to keep turning this so you get a bunch of different angles at it. This small dent right here is called the coronoid fossa. Let me show you why. I know we haven't gotten there yet, but remember that ulna that I drew on the whiteboard for you? This thing right here was the coronoid process, and it fits into that dent of your elbow. So just like the mandibular fossa, this fossa gets its name for what fits into it, that coronoid process of the ulna. So this is the coronoid fossa. The great big giant dent, the very large one on the reverse side of this bone, is called the olecranon fossa. And you guessed it, because the olecranon goes into it, like so. Olecranon fossa on the back for the olecranon process, coronoid fossa on the front for the coronoid process. Notice the olecranon process is much bigger than the coronoid, so it requires a larger dent. We also have these two rollers here and here. One right here from here to there, and this little one over here. This rolling surface is called the trochlea. This one is called the trochlea. The smaller one is the capitulum. In fact, the smaller one, I don't know if you can see it, is sort of shaped like a C, like the letter C, a capitulum, right here. The trochlea goes into the trochlear notch of my ulna. Remember the scoop of this bone, right here where my finger is, that's the trochlear notch, which fits around the trochlea. So think about this before I leave this particular view. The coronoid process goes into the coronoid fossa. The olecranon process goes into the olecranon fossa. The trochlea fits into the trochlear notch of the ulna. Trochlea, capitulum, coronoid fossa, olecranon fossa. Now, we've hit most of the parts of this bone except for two. These two structures right here, which are called epicondyles. Now, we saw the term condyle in our last lab. Remember those occipital condyles, rolling surfaces on the bottom of the occipital bone. These two structures, the capitulum on your left, the trochlea on your right, these two structures, the capitulum right here, the trochlea right there, these are condyles. They just have specific names. The capitulum, the trochlea. Areas on the bone that are just above the condyles are called epicondyles, above the condyle. Now, an easy way to find epicondyles is to take two fingers, straddle the shaft of the bone, or diaphysis of the bone, if you already learned that in lecture, and pull straight down till your fingers stop. Right now, my fingers are resting upon the epicondyles. How do I know which one is which? Lateral versus medial. Look to the head of the bone. See the head of the bone, which must face inward or medially to articulate with your scapula. Maybe this will help. So I want you to look at me. This is the same exact thing I would do in lab if you were seated right here going over these bones. So I see the head of the bone. The ball of the shoulders ball in socket. It must face a medial direction because that's where the joint is, not lateral. So once I see the head of this bone, I know that this is the medial side. So watch me. Straddle the bone, pull my fingers down. This is the medial epicondyle. This is the lateral epicondyle. The medial epicondyle is on the side with the trochlea. The lateral epicondyle is on the side with the capitulum. Let's zoom in again. So look at my humerus here. Notice the head of the bone, this is medial. That makes this the medial epicondyle on the side where the trochlea is located. That makes this the lateral epicondyle on the side with the capitulum. Medial, lateral. Look at the same bone from the other side. Medial epicondyle, see? So this would have to be the lateral epicondyle. Here is the trochlea. Here is the capitulum. Here is the greater and lesser tubercle, and the intertubercular groove, sometimes called the bicipital groove, because one of the tendons of your biceps brachii muscle lives here. Greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, deltoid tuberosity, trochlea, capitulum, medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle, coronoid fossa, olecranon fossa. This bone is one of the 6 that you have to position right or left. I could show you this bone and force you to tell me, is this a right or a left humerus? The way to do that is to use a couple of the features we have already seen, namely the head of the bone, which is medial, and the top of the bone. Say that again. The head is medial and superior. Then the other thing you have to know is the big dent, the olecranon fossa, faces back. I'm going to say that again. The head is top and medial. The big dent faces backwards. So just look at the bone as it naturally lies here. I can see the head, so I know that the head of this imaginary person would be up here. This is medial, so their chest would be right here. If their chest is right here where my hand is, and this is their head, the only other thing I have to look for is my big dent. Can I see the big dent of this bone? No. It's posterior, so I cannot see it. So is this person facing up or facing down on the table? Since I cannot see the big dent, since I do see the trochlea and the capitulum, this is the anterior side of the bone. The person is facing up. Their chest is here. They're facing up. This is a left humerus. I'm going to say that again. This one is a left humerus because the person's medial side, their chest is here, their face is here, and their back is on the table they're facing up a left humerus. Try this one. I see the head, so I know that the person's head is here, say where this bottle is. I know that the person's chest would have to be here where this sheet of paper is. Head, chest. Can you see the big dent or not? Yes. So am I looking at the back or the front of this person? Since this is a posterior feature of the bone, I am looking at their back. They're laying face down. Here's their torso. That makes this one a right humerus. A right humerus. Again, look for that in the practice. Here's the next bone on our list, the radius. The bone that's found on the thumb side of your forearm. The radius bone. Now, I know I sound like a broken record, or perhaps I should say a broken MP3 file, and I just keep repeating myself, but it is to your benefit to draw these bones first. Draw it first, then you can learn the parts usually quite a bit faster. Now this bone, you are not required to know right from left. You're just supposed to know the name of the bone, the radius, and if I show you an actual radius from a person, you can see that a radius looks like a radius, which looks like a radius. So once you know a radius, you know the radius. And let's take a look at the three parts of the radius you're responsible to know. The first is this one, the radial tuberosity. Now you may say, hey Dwayne, in the earlier part of the lab, I could hardly see that tuberosity on the humerus. Well, this tuberosity is much more obvious on a radius than it is on a humerus. So this, the radial tuberosity, here it is again on this bone, the real one. Here it is on this other plastic one, and that's probably about as crappy a radial tuberosity as you find. So that's the radial tuberosity. Next up we have what's called the styloid process. Now remember, you saw a styloid process on the skull in lab number 3. That's a projection, a process from a bone that is sharp, pointy. This right here, this is the styloid process of this bone. Look at this one, the end, so we can see a radius and a very easy to identify styloid process. Notice how it slopes downward here. That's the styloid process. And a third, very easy to identify styloid process. On what bone? The radius. The third and final part of this bone you're responsible for knowing is found just opposite of the styloid process. That's right here where my finger is. This is called the ulnar notch. Not ulnar notch, to make fun of my name here, but the ulnar notch. This is where the ulna fits against this bone or articulates with it. So here's a perfectly good radius. I find the styloid process and I look immediately opposite it, and right here, let me bring it a little closer, you can see a very beautiful ulnar notch right there. One more, plastic bone, styloid process, ulnar notch. So, as long as you can identify the radius and you see a styloid process, the only bone marking that I could ask you on the other side is the ulnar notch. The bone is the radius, radial tuberosity. Remember, this is the bone with the crappy one. This one's better. Radial tuberosity, styloid process, ulnar notch. Let's take a look at this bone over on Sam. So it might help us to visualize Sam's arm. I can see the radius right here on the thumb side, the radius. As I rotate the arm a little bit, perhaps you can see a radial tuberosity. You can see a styloid process. The thing you can't see very well is the ulnar notch, because the other forearm bone, the ulna, is sitting right in it. That's where those two bones articulate. So radius, radial tuberosity, styloid process, and ulnar notch. Perhaps you can feel that styloid process on your own wrist. If I move my watch, right down here as a knob, I feel a process on my ulna side. I can feel a knob right here on the radial side. That's the styloid process. A little zoom in on the elbow so I can see the radius right here against this capitulum of the humerus. I can see the radial tuberosity. If I lift this up, I can see the styloid process right there on the thumb side, and the ulnar notch right in there, which I cannot see because the ulna, the other forearm bone, is nestled right in there. Next up, we have what amounts to be the partner of the radius, the other forearm bone, the one that lives on the pinky finger side, called the ulna. In fact, I once had a roommate many, many years ago, and people nicknamed him Radius. Why would they do that? Well, obviously, so when they saw the two of us together, they could say, oh, look, here comes Radius and Ulnar. Yeah, it was only funny about the first 50 times. After that, it got a little old, but I can see the play on words. So, not ulnar, but ulna is this bone right here. It's got several features that we need to know. Coronoid process, which we already said goes into the coronoid fossa of the humerus. The olecranon process, which goes into the olecranon fossa, the big dent of the humerus. The trochlear notch, which is covered up by the trochlea right now, and also a styloid process, an ulnar notch, or excuse me, radial notch, down here on the distal end. So we've got this bone, the ulna, making the knob of your elbow, that olecranon process. When a person's in anatomical position like Sam is, this would be the bone that's on the medial side, with the radius being on the lateral side. So let's take a look at this ulna in isolation. So here we have a pile of ulnas, and who doesn't have a pile of ulnas laying around? These are all artificial ones or plastic bones. Here I have a real one, but notice a very distinctive characteristic look of this bone. This is the one I drew on the whiteboard earlier. looks like a wrench or an ice cream scoop, if you will. You can always identify it by its very, very prominent, where my finger is, trochlear notch. So the trochlear notch, a very, very prominent, obvious feature of this bone. There aren't really any other bones that we have that look like this one. So let's just pick on one ulna here. So this one in my hand showing me all the features. Let's begin again with the trochlear notch, this notch where my finger is that articulates with that trochlea, that rolling condyle at the bottom of the humerus. Notice how the trochlear notch forms a valley, and we have two processes, one on each side of the valley. The big knob of your elbow is the olecranon process. On the other side of the valley, we have the coronoid process. Coronoid process, and this whole knob right here is the olecranon process. These are on either side of that trochlear notch. Then we have, I can see right here, I'll turn it so shadow gets cast in it, the radial notch, where the head of a radius goes to spin around like this. So that's the radial notch right here, much smaller than the trochlear notch. So two notches, trochlear notch, radial notch. Then we have a styloid process on this bone as well. Look at that, sharp, pokey, styloid process. So as I look at this bone, I can see several of the features right now: the coronoid process, the olecranon process, the trochlear notch, and the styloid process over here. But everyone, be aware, I cannot see the radial notch in this view because it only lives on one side of the bone, on the side where the radius would go. So I think we should probably consult with Sam a little bit on this one. So let's go talk with Sam. Okay, so here's Sam, and sometimes looking at a fully articulated skeleton can be very helpful. So focus your attention on the forearm. Not the arm, the forearm. We have the radius, which is here on the thumb side, and the ulna, which is here on the pinky side, or the medial side of the forearm when a person's in anatomical position. It's important to get these directional terms down because this helps us position this particular bone as a right or a left. So you need to understand that the radial notch of this bone faces in a lateral direction to where the thumb would be in anatomical position. So yes, I can see the features, the styloid process, the trochlear notch is occupied by the trochlea right now, the olecranon process, which goes into the olecranon fossa of the humerus, the coronoid process, and the radial notch, which I can only see a little bit of right here, which allows us to do this pronation of our forearm. The radial notch is occupied by the head of the radius. But the location of this radial notch will be the key that we use to position this bone right versus left. Let's do that right now. So here we are looking back at our isolated ulna, and knowing the parts of a bone is required before you can really position it right versus left for some of these more difficult bones. So think of what we did for the scapula. We have to do a similar mental exercise here. So what I want you to do is look at this bone very carefully. I want you to identify for yourself the radial notch, which we find right here, the trochlear notch, which we find right there, the styloid process, which is right here, and I want you to watch very carefully how I hold this bone. Feel free to stop and rewind me 100 times to get this down. The styloid process points away from me. The trochlear notch faces straight up off the table. And as long as I hold the bone like this, all I have to do is look for where the radial notch is located. If the radial notch is on the left side of the bone, as we look at it right now, this is a left ulna. I'm going to say that again. If the radial notch is on the left side of the bone, as long as I'm holding it like this, this is a left ulna because it must face laterally. This is a left ulna. Let's look at this one. Identify the parts. Trochlear notch, radial notch. If I hold the bone like this, notice that the radial notch is on the right side of the bone. This is a right ulna. It's as simple as that once you know the parts. Let's look at this one, which is a real bone from a real person. Identify your parts. Trochlear notch, radial notch. Is this a right or a left ulna? I'll wait. I'm not bothered at all by the uncomfortable silence, everyone. This is a left ulna. What's this one? Now, you probably didn't need the whole Jeopardy song, but I just sort of got into the whistling. So, which one is this? Look at that radial notch. Left. Let's look at this one. What is this one? A left or a right ulna? Trochlear notch is up. Where's that radial notch? Right there. Right. I'll do one more with you. What's this one? Radial notch, trochlear notch, left ulna. It really is as simple as that. But you have to see it in this view, and you have to find that radial notch, everyone. Hey, do you think you could lend me a hand here studying these bones? I know, not very funny, but you've got to take humor in the lab when you're by yourself as you can find it. So here we have a hand. This one happens to be an anterior view of a right hand, like that. I can see the radius here on the thumb side, the ulna here on the pinky side, but it would be pretty hard to tell if all you could see was this. Just remember which side they're on, and of course the radius is very wide here on its distal end, but this is not a view I would ask you to identify these two bones. I would use this view to ask you to identify these bones. Let's begin with this group of 8 bones right here called the carpals. These are the carpals or the wrist bones. Think of perhaps carpal tunnel syndrome, the pinching of a nerve you may have heard of someone having there. And when you see these bones, you can understand how they move around a little bit and have some strange little joints in there, which are definitely worthy of anatomical study, just not part of Bio 223. So as a group, these bones are called the carpals. You need to know that. Each one has a name, pisiform, trapezium, lunate, etc., but only one that you have to know the specific name of, and that's this one right here called the scaphoid bone. The scaphoid. The big one at the base of the thumb is the scaphoid bone. The only carpal you have to know the specific name of. This row of bones that we see right here, which make up the palm of your hand, these are the metacarpals. These are the metacarpals. The wrist bones are the carpals. The palm bones are the metacarpals. Now, one method that I use to help me remember this is I always think of, I meet some other person, here they are, who I'm going to share a car ride with, and that person and I, we're going to ride together, so they are my car pal. So I shake hands with them, say I'm shaking hands, and the actual bones that we press together are the metacarpals. So I say I just met a car pal. Get it? I know that's not a great one, but it's not a terrible one either. So carpals, metacarpals. Now the metacarpals are numbered. So are your digits. So are your metatarsals in your foot and your toes. Roman numeral 1 is the thumb. 2, 3, 4, 5 is the pinky side. So this bone is not just a metacarpal, it's metacarpal 1. This is metacarpal 2, 3, 4, and 5, and they must be Roman numerals. I, V, V, like that. Can't be standard numbers or your answer will be wrong. And I guarantee you'll see that from time to time. Somebody will say, metacarpal 3, and they'll call it a 3. 3 like that, not Roman numeral 3. Has to be a Roman numeral for you to get credit on your answer. Remember I said that. Carpals, metacarpals, and then out here we have the phalanges, the finger bones, or the phalanx bones. Called a phalanx, for those of you history buffs, think of King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, they make a phalanx, that column or rectangle of troops with their shields and all that stuff. Watch the movie if you want to. You can watch everybody just painted on abs. But we have the phalanx bones right here, and they are in 3 rows. The proximal phalanx bones, the middle phalanx bones, and then the little bitty distal phalanx bones, because your fingers have 3 phalanx bones in them. Not so with thumbkin over here, big toe as well. Thumbkin only has 2. Proximal, distal phalanx. No middle phalanx here. Remember that. Proximal, distal. Proximal, middle, distal, proximal, middle, distal, like that. Do not confuse the metacarpals with the phalanx bones, even though they look similar in the view you will see. Remember, your palm, metacarpals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Look for the pinky, look for the thumb. I don't think you'll have too much trouble with that. Okay, so we're back with our good friend Sam here, and looking at page 2 of lab number 4, we need to now talk about the bones that form the pelvic girdle. of your skeleton. So we had a pectoral girdle. You remember that. We already talked about it. Now we have to talk about the three bones that form the pelvic girdle. The ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And a lot of features that they have. So pay very careful attention, and I would suggest that you pause, rewind me, watch this a number of times. Many people get confused by some of the pelvic features. So let's look at these three fused pelvic bones. So this is a pelvic girdle. A whole bunch of bones, of course, are visible here to us, not all of which are part of lab number 4. So if I tilt this a little bit, we can see what we learned in lab number 3, the sacrum, and the last few lumbar vertebrae, a few fibrocartilage discs or intervertebral discs there. But there are a couple of things you can see on this particular model that you can't really see on an individual, what we would call a pelvic bone, which is 3 fused bones. The pubis right here, the ischium right there, and the big blade, which is the ilium. But in this view, the bones together, I can see this fibrocartilage joint right here connecting the left and right pubic bones. This is called the pubic symphysis. Look at that term in your textbook. This is the pubic symphysis right here, this joint. Now, while I can ask you that, I would have to see 2 put together pubic bones in order to ask you that. And for lecture purposes, look at this, I can see this subpubic or inferior pubic angle there. Might come up in your lecture class. And across the top of this pubic symphysis, I have what's known as the pubic crest. So it goes from my pointer to my pointer. So this line, this ridge right across the top, from one pubic bone across to the other one, that's the pubic crest, which is the sections on the bone. The joint, the fibrocartilage joint, is the pubic symphysis. Across the top right here, I have the pubic crest. Can't really see that unless I have an articulated pelvis. For the most part, we will look at individual pelvic bones, like this one. Often referred to as a pelvic bone, sometimes an os coxa, you may hear that term. This is the fusion of 3 bones in your body. The pubic bone, the ilium, and the ischium. 3 bones. So look at those on the left side of page number 2, lab 4. The pubis, the ischium, and the ilium. 3 bones that we're looking at here. Let's start with the pubis, the pubic bone. As I hold this thing up, I can see this great big blade, and this pointed at you. This person is lying on their back, their pelvis is facing you. I can see this bone right here. Notice how thin it is. This is the pubis. It goes from about my thumbnail right here up into this big cavity called the acetabulum. This is the pubic bone, or the pubis, which of course makes part of the pubic symphysis and pubic crest. The pubis, or pubic bone, right here, the thin one on the front side of this hole. Now, there aren't too many things about the pubic bone to know other than its name, the pubic bone. But you have to know it's this region of an os coxa because there actually are sutures here and here where these bones are fused. They just don't come apart. It's such a tight, good joint in the pelvis here. So the pubic bone, as you might see right here, it makes an angle, doesn't it? And the two legs of this angle that I can see right here, here's a leg of the angle. Each one of them is called a ramus. This one that's essentially continuous with the pubic crest is the superior ramus. This one down here is the inferior ramus. So superior pubic ramus, inferior pubic ramus. The superior one is up here where the big blade is. See that? The superior one is top where the big blade is. If we look at an articulated pelvis again, right here, so see the superior pubic ramus right there, inferior pubic ramus right here, up to about, oh, let's say midway or so along this run of bone. Then we have the ischium. This one that's in the back. Notice how much thicker the ischium is than the pubis. The pubis is a relatively thin piece of bone right here when compared with the ischium. Look at this. This is the ischium. I'll show it to you on a real human bone. Notice the pubic bone, superior ramus, inferior ramus, like that. And then back here on the backside, look at that ischium. Now the ischium is actually thicker, a more dense, a more substantial piece of bone. This is what I am sitting on right now. You're probably sitting on yours. You sit on the ischium bone. I'm sitting on this thing right now, my ischium. It becomes thicker because I constantly apply force to it. Remember that when you have your 223 lecture on the engineering components of bone and how bone is a composite dynamic living tissue that changes as a result of the forces acting on it. If you're in my lecture, you're going to hear me say that a lot. The ischium is bigger because we sit on it. A little memory trick, I imagine sitting in one of those beanbag chairs, or what do they call it, love sack chairs, something like that, full of beanbags. When you sit down on it, what sound does it make? Ish. Ish. I sit on the ischium bone, so it's thicker than the pubic bone is. I don't sit on the pubic bone, so it doesn't need to be. It doesn't develop that huge density like the ischium does. Now, the ischium has a few parts that you need to know. So I want you to use your imagination and imagine about halfway from here to here, there would be a suture, which there is. I could even see they created one on this artificial bone. I have no idea if the resolution would allow you to see that little fake suture right there. But the back half of this would be the ischial ramus. This is the inferior pubic ramus. So create an imaginary line in your mind right here. This is the pubic bone, superior, inferior ramus, and then this is the ischial ramus right there. We also have an ischial spine, which is this knob or protrusion of bone you see right there, the ischial spine, right there where my finger is. The ischial spine. A spine is a little sharp projection. Here's a couple spines up here that we'll learn in a minute. So this one is the ischial spine because it's on the ischium bone. We also have the ischial tuberosity, which is this knob right here that I'm running my finger over. The ischial tuberosity, right there. I'll show it to you on a different bone. So here again is an ischium of the os coxa, the pelvic bone. Here is a very nice ischial spine, right there. Turn it. Imagine a suture right here. This is the ischial ramus. This is the inferior pubic ramus. Again, ischial spine right there at the tip of my finger. And this knob right there, ischial tuberosity. So don't confuse it with the spine or the ramus. Name of the bone, ischium. Ischial ramus, ischial spine, ischial tuberosity. Then we have the big bone, the ilium, this great big blade of bone that we see. This bone is the ilium, the most superior of the three pelvic bones. You might think of it as your hip. Imagine that you become irritated with someone and you put your hands on your hips. Your hands go right here to what we call the iliac crest. Look for that term. This is the iliac crest. Iliac crest right here. Also right here on the other side, iliac crest. Now, remember how the sacrum had an auricular surface where it forms the sacroiliac joint, sacroilium joint, sacroiliac joint? Well, the ilium has an auricular surface too. Always look for that because there are a bunch of features on this side for us to know. So first, let's go slowly here. This is the iliac crest. Got it? This rough-looking spot, again, sometimes people call this a bone scar. This is the auricular surface. And within the auricular surface, there's a knob, a bump. See it right there? That is called the iliac tuberosity. Remember, these tuberosities can be felt easier than seen, but it's this knob right here, the iliac tuberosity, right in the middle of the auricular surface. Now, I know what you're thinking because you're smart, and you're thinking, hey, Dwayne, Mr. Smarty Pants, what if you indicate this on a lab quiz or a practical? How do I know what you want the name of? Auricular surface or iliac tuberosity? I would have to create the question in such a way that there's only one correct answer. So if I simply had a dot on this knob and said name the structure, iliac tuberosity. If I indicated the entire region here of the bone scar, auricular surface. But I will have to create the question so there's one and only one correct answer, because guess what? Dwayne doesn't like accepting two correct answers. None of us A&P nerds like that. So auricular surface, iliac tuberosity, iliac crest. Now on this same side, same view, where I see the auricular surface, I have a big depression in this bone called the iliac fossa. That's this depression that you see right here. This is the iliac fossa. Now we've hit most of the structures, but we're still a few short. Still a couple short. Next, I want you to notice that ischial spine right here, and then this big notch right there. See that big notch? This is the greater sciatic notch. The greater sciatic notch. Guess what shoots out of there posteriorly on a person? Your sciatic nerve. I bet you figured that out. So the greater sciatic notch right there above the ischial spine, this big groove. The greater sciatic notch. Also, on the ilium, we have 4 corners that you need to know the names of. You can see them right here. We call them spines. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me show those to you again. Corner, 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 corner. Now look for that auricular surface. Look for that iliac crest to help you out. The 2 corners on top are the superior iliac spines. Superior iliac spines. The one that's continuous, I guess I would say, with the auricular surface, this one right here, is the one on the back side, the posterior. It's above the ischium. It's not on the side with the pubis. Maybe you can see that. Let me zoom out a little bit. So this corner is the posterior superior iliac spine. This one is the posterior inferior iliac spine. This one is the anterior superior iliac spine and the anterior inferior iliac spine. Let's go through those again, shall we? I'll even flip it around to the other side. Here we go. This would make it tougher. See where the pubic bone is? Anterior superior iliac spine. Anterior inferior iliac spine. Posterior superior iliac spine and posterior inferior iliac spine. Let's try it on a real bone. So here's another os coxa or pelvic bone, right? So see the auricular surface here? So posterior superior iliac spine, posterior inferior iliac spine. On the front side, I'll angle it, I think you can see anterior superior iliac spine, anterior inferior iliac spine. One more time. How about this bone right here? See the auricular surface, iliac crest, anterior superior iliac spine, anterior inferior iliac spine, posterior inferior iliac spine, and the not very well defined on this bone, posterior superior iliac spine. There we have all these spines, and of course don't forget our ischial spine right there, the spine of the ischium. Now we already did the pubic symphysis, but we have this socket here, this great big depression that the head of your femur goes into. This thing is called the acetabulum. You can say acetabulum if you like. Doesn't really matter on an online quiz as long as you recognize the word. But this big depression, the head of your femur goes in here, the socket for the ball and socket joint that is your hip. And unlike that glenoid cavity, irritating air quotes, up in your shoulder, this thing is really a cavity, isn't it? So this is the acetabulum, is this big depression right here. And last but not least, we have this hole right here in the middle of a coxal bone. What's that called? The obturator foramen. A foramen is a hole in the bone. This is the obturator foramen. I actually have a way to remember this one that has lived with me ever since my college days. So pay attention. A little way to help you remember the name of this hole right here in the os coxa, I will share with you, came from my days long ago as an undergraduate biology student. Not that you people want to hear a bunch of Dwayne anecdotes, but it's an online lab, so you're sort of stuck with it. I was in a class called comparative anatomy. Had to memorize all these different parts of all these different animals and all these different skeletons. And there was a group of us sitting at a table working like you people would do if you were actually here with me right now. And we were working on the pelvic bones. There was another student in our class. His name was Josh. I remember Josh because, one, Josh always wore completely matching clothes. His hat matched his sweatshirt, which matched his sweatpants, which matched his shoes. Color coordinated. Red, green, black, gray, blue, yellow. He had all sorts of different cotton sweatsuits, and that's what he wore every time I saw him. I also remember Josh because while he was a very nice guy, he flunked everything. He was in comparative anatomy, and I don't know that he ever got above a 50 on anything. But he helped me remember this. So I and a few other students were seated, we were working on the pelvic bone, and somebody in the group said this: how in the heck am I going to remember the name of this hole? At that precise moment, Josh is walking behind our table. And as one of my lab partners said, how the heck am I going to remember the name of this hole? Josh said, oh, that's easy. He stuck his fingers through the hole, held it up to his face, and said, hello, obturator? I have never forgotten that, lo, these many years. So what's the name of this hole in the pelvic bone? Hello, obturator? And you can say, thank you, Josh, for that one. The other thing we have to do with one of these bones is to be able to determine right from left when you see an os coxa, when you see a pelvic bone. How do I know if this thing is a right one or a left one? Well, I think we need some help from Sam on this one. Hey Sam, do you know a right from a left pelvic bone? Oh yes, he does. All right, he can help us. So let's look at this pelvic girdle a little more closely on Sam. So first notice that the iliums, the iliac crest, is superior. The pubic bones are forward, and that acetabulum, the socket, is lateral so that the head of the femur can come into it. I'm going to repeat myself one time. Iliac crests are up, pubic bone is forward, and the acetabulum is lateral. Thank you, Sam. So now if we look at an isolated, by itself, pelvic bone or os coxa, I see my ilium, iliac crest. I know that must face up, like so. Or in anatomical position on a two-dimensional screen like that. But which of these two bones is anterior? Well, this is the ischium, this is the pubis. So the pubis goes forward. Iliac crest is up, pubic bone is forward. Then I have to decide where's the acetabulum. There it is. It's lateral. The head of the femur goes in it. This is forward. The person is facing us. Their leg comes out over here. Is this a right or a left os coxa? Think about it. Pubic bone is forward. They're facing us. And their leg goes down this way. Their femur comes out and goes down because this is where the acetabulum is. This is a right pelvic bone, isn't it? Pause, rewind me, think about it. Let's look at this one, the real bone. Ilium and iliac crest go up. Pubic bone is forward, and here's that acetabulum. This one is also a right os coxa, isn't it? I wonder if I have a left one around here somewhere that's not articulated into a skeleton. I found another one, but look, everybody, this one's a right. This one's a right. Oh, look at this one. This one's a lefty. Pubic bone, iliac crest, acetabulum. There is a left one. A left coxal bone or os coxa, aka pelvic bone. In case you haven't noticed, we're working essentially in a superior to inferior direction. So right after the pelvic girdle, we have the femur, the massive, big, weight-supporting femur with the ball on it that goes into the acetabulum. So here is a perfectly good view of a femur. Now the femur has a number of features or markings that you have to know, but the nice thing is most of them are very easy to find and identify. So I don't see you having a lot of trouble with this, but make sure you go through it enough times. So the femur has a head and a neck, which are not on your list of things to know, but if we look at the head of the femur, this thing right here, the ball that goes into the acetabulum, you will notice there's a dent, a small fossa here on the head of the femur that actually is the place where a ligament helps hold it in to the acetabulum. This thing is called the fovea capitis. This is the fovea capitis right here, this dent in the head of the femur. Also, near the head of the femur, on its superior end, I see two great big knobs of bone. These are called trochanters. Trochanters. Your femur has two. Just like your humerus way back when had 2 tubercles, your femur has 2 trochanters. These are much larger projections of bone. Trochanters are very large, tubercles are sort of mid-sized, and then tuberosities are small. So this big one right here on the top, across from the head of the bone, is the greater trochanter. And this little one down below the neck of the bone, this is the lesser trochanter. Greater and lesser trochanters of the femur. Not very hard to spot. Great big knobs of bone. Now, let's go all the way down to the bottom of the femur. The other end, or epiphysis of the bone, if you will. And I see that the bottom of the femur is dominated by 2 large rolling surfaces that form part of my knee joint, allowing the bone to roll like that, or actually for your tibia to roll. These 2 things are called condyles. One of them is medial, one is lateral. How the heck are you supposed to know the difference? Well, that's what you have me for in this online lab. Notice the head of the bone. That's medial. So the condyle that is on the same side as the head is the medial condyle. The one that's on the opposite side is the lateral condyle. So you have to be able to see the head of the bone. And once you can see that, this is the medial condyle and this is the lateral condyle. And just like the humerus, we have a couple of epicondyles, medial and lateral. The same thing I've told you before, straddle the diaphysis of the bone, pull your hands down quick until your fingers stop, and you are now right on the 2 epicondyles. Again, I use the head of the bone here. I use the head of the bone to orient me. Let me angle it a little bit. So the head of the bone, medial condyle, medial epicondyle. Lateral condyle, lateral epicondyle. And this rather large groove that we see between the 2 condyles, let me zoom in so you can have a better view of it. This rather large groove that I see right here is the intercondylar fossa. The fossa that's between the 2 condyles. Condyle, condyle, intercondylar fossa of a femur. I'm going to stay partially zoomed in here because I want you to watch my finger as I run up the shaft of the bone. And do you see this line that I'm following here? This line. This is a feature on this bone called the linea aspera, or the aspiral line. It's on the posterior side of the bone where these 2 condyles are. This is the back side of the bone. On the front side of the bone, there's no linea aspera. It's only on the back side of the bone. So here's the front of the bone. I can see the greater and lesser trochanters. No linea aspera. And I can't really see the condyles. They're back here behind. But this is where the patella lives. Let me zoom in for a slightly better view. See this smooth, slick spot? We could say a facet if we wanted to. This is where the patella sits. So this is the patellar groove. Notice I cannot see an obvious condyle on either side. That's on the reverse side of the bone. So if I see the two condyles, plain and simple, intercondylar fossa. If I don't, patellar groove. Now, spend a little time and go over these. Pause me, rewind me, you know how it works. But this bone you must also be able to tell a right from a left. And it's pretty easy, as long as you remember a couple things to position the bone. First, the head is medial, going into Sam's thigh, or excuse me, hip. Let's ask Sam. Let's go right over there and ask him. There it is. Notice how the head of the femur goes into the acetabulum. So that's a medial structure, that head of the femur. And see these two patellas that I have? That patellar groove is anterior, or the condyles are posterior. That's another way to think of it. So let's come back to our bone. Thank you, Sam. Let's come back to our femur that we are looking at. So the head of the bone is medial, and the patellar groove is anterior. So this person's pelvis would be right here where my hand is, wouldn't it? And since this is anterior, they're facing us. So which side is this one? This is a left femur. Another way to think of it. Let me just turn it over. Very obvious, this view. See the two condyles and the intercondylar fossa? The big dent is posterior, just like that big dent on the humerus was posterior. So the big dent is posterior, the head is medial. This person is laying down, stomach side down on the table. Their pelvis would be right here, facing downward. This is a left femur. Now, of course, it's a left because it's the same exact bone. But let me randomly pick another one. I don't really care. Here's one. I see the head. That's medial and superior, isn't it? Do you see the two big condyles right here? No. I see the patellar groove. So this is the front side. They're face up. Pelvis is here. This is a right femur. If I look at the back side, same logic. The head is medial, so their pelvis lives here. And I do see the condyles and the big dent, the intercondylar fossa. This person is face down. Face down, pelvis is here. They'd have to have another leg over here, so this is a right femur. The beauty of an online lab, unlike being here in person, you can pause me, rewind, play this over and over again until you get it right. So make sure you can tell right from left on the femur. Okay, people, put your money down and let's begin. Round and round we go. Where we stop, nobody knows. Which one has the dot? This one? No, you lose. This one? No, you lose. I keep your money. This one? Yes, there it is. Now, what these are, I'm having fun. All right, what these are patellas, everyone, your kneecap. And the patella is not a particularly rough bone to know once you understand that it essentially looks like an arrowhead or a triangle. Once I see the triangular look of a patella, then everything gets pretty easy. The apex is the point of the triangle or the arrowhead. Apex. Whoops. The base is the other side, which is essentially flat or wider. Remember, base or basal means the wider spot, not necessarily the bottom. For the patella, the apex is down, isn't it? So base, base, and then on the back side of a patella, we have a couple of facets. We have a couple facets. A lateral facet and a medial facet. The lateral facet is larger. L for lateral, L for larger. It's typically the larger facet, lateral facet. See that? It's bigger. Let's look at this one. The lateral facet, the medial facet. These all three happen to be from the same side, not that that matters. Look at the different size of the facets. Lateral is larger, medial is smaller. You do not have to know right from left patella, even though you could tell. I don't get to ask you that. So, apex, base, lateral, and medial facets. That's it for the patellas, and I'm just going to keep your money because you didn't pick the right one anyway, did you? What we see here is a pile of fibulas, and the fibula is a fairly easy bone for us because you don't have to tell right from left, and you only need to know two things. One, the name of the bone, and two, the lateral malleolus. You can say malleolus if you prefer. Either pronunciation is acceptable. But let's take a walk over to Sam and see where this bone is. The thing that tends to confuse a lot of people about the leg, and the leg is the area between your knee and your ankle. Up here where the femur lives, that's your thigh. The thing that tends to confuse people about the leg is this fibula. This is the lateral bone. It's on the outside, pinky toe side. The tibia, the great big weight bearer, that's on the big toe or the medial side. So if you look at Sam's leg, straight on, you see the fibulas are lateral or outside, the tibias are medial. Look at this skeleton right here, same thing. Fibula, tibia. Now, the reason I point this out will be apparent in a moment. Okay, so the reason I point out that the fibula is lateral is because of this structure right here. This is called the lateral malleolus or malleolus because this bone is on the lateral side. So if you look at this entire fibula, the only feature I can ask you is right here, and that's the lateral malleolus because this is a lateral bone. Now, like all bones, many of these other parts are named. You just don't have to know those names. just another random fibula. Notice the what? Lateral malleolus. Easy. I'm not exactly sure why, but this bone always makes me think of Hamlet. Tibia or not tibia? That is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to know the parts of this bone, of course it's nobler in the mind. Yes, Professor Allner's getting a little kooky here in the lab, but that's okay. This is a tibia. The big shaft of bone bearing weight in your leg. And it has a number of features that you have to know on this particular bone, but much like the femur, they are fairly easy to identify. And I want to start down at the bottom of this bone with this big knob right here called the medial malleolus. I'm going to say that one again. This is the medial malleolus or malleolus. The fibula had the lateral malleolus on it. In fact, if you think about it, yes, this is my foot right here. These big knobs, one side and the other side of my ankle, this side, the big toe side, is the medial malleolus right there. That's it. And over here is the lateral malleolus. These are bony prominences, easy to find. And once I see this one on my tibia, then everything else sort of falls into place a little bit. So structures on this side would be medial. Structures on the other side would be lateral. Like this one directly opposite the medial malleolus is this notch that we see right here. This is the fibular notch, where the fibula sits. Find the medial malleolus, and then I can identify this as the fibular notch. This bone also has two condyles on it, a medial condyle and a lateral condyle. If we look at the top of this thing, up here, watch me turn it, I see two rolling surfaces which really are more like facets, here and here. The medial and lateral condyles. Now I'm going to keep this view for a moment so you can see what we have here. This is the way your femur sits in there. Its two condyles riding on these two condyles. I don't know that I've ever been that crazy about calling those structures on the top of the tibia condyles, but that's the name they have, and that's the name we're stuck with. The condyles. Which one's medial? The one that's on the same side as the medial malleolus. What's the other one? The lateral condyle. And let me give my camera a second to focus. See this raised portion between the two condyles? This is called the intercondylar eminence, the high spot between the two condyles. This knob that you can see, I'm rubbing my thumb on right now, is the tibial tuberosity. This is the tibial tuberosity. So if I lay the bone down like this, again, I can see a number of structures here. Medial malleolus, fibular notch. medial side, medial condyle, lateral condyle, intercondylar eminence, right there, and the tibial tuberosity, excuse me, which some of you people are going to find, and, you know, for reflexes, you got a little spot just below there, and you whack them with a hammer, you know, to get the patellar reflex. So, tibial tuberosity, actually you go up a little bit from that, sorry. You find that and you go up a little bit from it. What am I talking about? You go up a little bit from it, that's where the tendon is, and you strike right there. Maybe I've been doing this too long. I don't know. Let's look at a different tibia. Here is a real one. A real person's tibia. Notice, once you know a tibia, you know tibias. Medial malleolus, subfibular notch. Medial and lateral condyles, intercondylar eminence, tibial tuberosity. But you have to know right from left on this one. Let me show you how I always do it. Because it's always the same for me when I do this on this particular bone. Just repositioning my camera slightly to maybe give you a little bit better view. So I can definitely see the medial malleolus, the great big condyles, the top of the bone. So I know this is the big toe side, and this tibial tuberosity right here goes forward. So is this person lying on his or her back or on their stomach? I'll wait. Are they lying on their back or their stomach? If I see this tibial tuberosity, they must be lying on their back, face up, facing me. Traditional anatomical position. This is the big toe side, which means their other leg is over here, their pelvis would be up there. This is a left tibia. Let's try a different one. I know I have some other ones here and there. Let's use this one. Oh, everybody look, this is the same, isn't it? This one is also a left tibia. How about this one? I see the medial malleolus, medial side, pelvis, other leg, because I see the tibial tuberosity, don't I? This is a right tibia. As always, I want you to feel free to pause me, rewind, watch this again and again until you get it down. Medial side, anterior side. This is a right tibia. You know, I have heard it said many times that people cannot estimate the size of skeletal parts without any muscles, tendons, or flesh on top of them. I think that's kind of silly, because I know how long this thing is. It's about a foot. I know, hilarious, isn't it? Yes, here we are, our last bit of the appendicular skeleton, which is your ankle and foot. The tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges here. So just like we had with the wrist, your ankle bones are called the tarsals. So that's the general name for all of these ankle bones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that I can see right here. Look at that, ankle bones. And 2 of them you must know the specific names of. They are this big one, the heel bone, called the calcaneus, and this one right here that the tibia sits on top of. This is that medial malleolus we just saw. This is the talus. So the tibia and the talus. The heel bone is the calcaneus. So specific tarsals, calcaneus and talus, the rest are just tarsals to you. Then we look at this foot and we can see, just like in the hand, Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the metatarsals. Metatarsals. Again, they must be Roman numerals. Do not let me trick you on a quiz or a practical with a standard or Arabic number. Has to be Roman numerals for these metatarsals. Remember the T's that I'm sort of over-articulating here. Tarsals, metatarsals are near the toes. Metatarsals. Then we have the same sort of idea here with the phalanx bones, the phalanges, proximal, middle, distal. Phalanx bones, except for the big toe, which only has 2, a proximal and a distal. Tarsals, metatarsals, phalanges, proximal, middle, distal phalanx bones. And that's it. So we can walk on over into a little practice for this lab, and let's kickstart our practice. I don't know how many more bad puns I could make with my foot here. So we'll get a foothold on this. Let's get your toes into the water, practicing the appendicular skeleton.